for being here today. We're so grateful. I'm personally so grateful to be in a position to bring the most amazing minds together to talk about something that I think is on a lot of people's minds, but you know, hasn't really manifested into something just yet. So thank you so much. Many of the people here have been hearing me kind of on this thought pattern for a while about the unseen patterns. So I know that there's lots of people here that feel prepared to contribute, and I'm excited about that. All right, so my thoughts about how we're going to structure today is that I have a few kind of framing slides, like kind of giving us how I'm thinking about this, because I know the title, Trauma of Unseen Patterns, even at baseline can seem a little, what is she talking about? And then Laurie Ross, Dr. Ross is going to talk about patterns in youth violence. And, you know, in research, we're always looking to see what the patterns are. What can we make of this? Hopefully, Dr. Castile will talk about systems. I know Reverend Payson is here, and he is an extraordinary thought leader in this. I know that there's also other folks here. I extended the invitation to everyone who's done a Trauma Training Tuesday to give their thoughts and input. And then we hopefully have plenty of time for the audience to let us know your thoughts about unseen patterns and what it means and how we can move forward. And then if we are able to just kind of, I don't know how nutshell we'll be able to get it, but if we can have some wrap up and just thinking about what to do with this. So the goals, and I'm you know, not entirely sure that all of these things are in the right buckets for goals and strategies and understandings. But just for me, doing this series, this trauma training series, I've seen so many things that I hadn't before. Many people have spoken about systems and have spoken about the ways in which systems are harming people, the ways in which systems maybe weren't designed to be helping systems, yet they are. And I think too, our systems are somewhat like roads in Boston. They just kind of cropped up and then we figured out how to connect them, but there was not necessarily lots of overarching planning that went into these things. And we're kind of making it up as we go and fixing it as we go. So I'm hoping we just see more than just our part, all the patterns that are present in our culture right now, and wonder about those, ask about those, and having conversations wherever you can to build people's connections to the things that we're not really seeing that are absolutely playing in our lives, playing out in our life experience. We're not going to solve anything right now in the next couple of hours, and that's not at all the intention. We're not going to be even remotely able to talk about solutions today. We're just going to talk about kind of understanding what this is and what has happened and how it is impacting us. I hope you like my kind of creepy, groovy, beneath the surface picture, right? There's often things going on that we have no idea about. I know a lot of, I see the audience has some NPEs in it, and we really understand about patterns you didn't see, things you didn't know, the pieces of information you didn't have that were still really impacting you. I know Erin is going to talk a little bit more about some of the principles of micro and macro. I'm a social worker, and I know there's some other social workers here, and we are trained to recognize that individual experience is often about much bigger issues, the sort of practical sociology, looking at our culture and the social issues and figuring out how those are playing out in people's lives. One of the challenges is so often we see that what's happening for people is so far out of their control. So knowing that, we do social change work as well. The recognition that those things have to go together. In the public health model, which is very similar to kind of macro social work, we ask about what's going on upstream. When this picture is like the kind of public health in a nutshell idea, you can see these rescuers are pulling people out of the river because they're drowning and we don't want them to get hurt, and we're pulling them out and bringing them to the hospital. But we also need to ask, like, how are all these people getting in the river? What's happening upstream that people are in the river? So it's a good way to think about our helping systems. I know we feel like we've been in this sort of helping emergency, and the helping emergency is only just beginning. And if we don't look at those upstream issues, we're going to just be right back here. The idea of community health is that we create environments and systems that serve people that are here to meet our needs. We believe in social work, in public health, in ministry, in research, that our environment and our circumstances are influencing our lives. That life is happening, things are happening on multiple levels. There's the things happening within our own minds, within our families, within our communities, within our culture, within our world. And many of these things look similar, whatever level you look at them, and also use the same sort of change principles. I know personally that I had this belief that I was the magical unicorn, that childhood trauma wasn't going to impact me into adulthood. I'm all set. I studied this stuff. I know it. And yeah, that didn't really work out so well for me. So the recognition that the things that I wasn't seeing in my own life were really causing me to make choices that were not choices I might consciously make. And so we see that in individual change, and Brad's here. So I hope he'll chime in about awareness, that just recognizing what's happening and what the pattern is such a big piece of it. Our culture really, really focuses on individual responsibility. It's, if you're having problems, it's got to be your fault. And the challenge with that is we take responsibility when a lot of times it's really not ours to take. We're just getting the results that were pretty much predestined for us to get. And that's part of this too. It's really hard to see what's going on around us because it's the water that we're swimming in. I know a number of presenters have sort of used that analogy that we can't see this when we're in it. We're too close. And that's part of my individual process, recognizing that I could really easily see other people's patterns and the ways they were living their lives, but I could not see my own at all. And when you make that observation, it's really important to reflect and make meaning. And is this what I want to be doing? Is this how I want it to go? So that's what we're asking you to do today on that sort of big level. Is this really the world we want? Are these the systems we want? And all of these things, I believe, are coming from trauma. It's that sort of, we work so hard to not be in pain, or we're just so far in pain that it colors all our decisions. Trying to maybe find some balance and be more kind of conscious about what we're doing. This is my last slide, and then I'm turning it over to Laurie. I sort of just wanted to take a minute to think about some of the things that I believe are underpinning where we started and why we're here. This idea in our culture that the myth of meritocracy, that people that are at the top are there because they deserve to be. They got there on their own merit. They worked the hardest. They brought the most to the table. And of course, we know that's absolutely a myth. People very much, where they start is going to have a lot to do with where they land. And we like to pretend that that's not the case. I think the people that usually want to tout the meritocracy are people that did get there through the fortunate circumstances of the birth lottery. The other thing that really underpins our thinking, I believe, is this idea. Somebody can that. You get that, Laurie or Aaron? Thanks. The idea that we don't have enough of anything really underpins so many of our systems. The myth of scarcity, we call that there's not enough resources, there's not enough beauty, there's not enough anything. And so we really have to fight hard to get our piece. But absolutely, the reality is that there's more than enough for everyone. And the problem is about distribution, not about supply. We have adopted this idea that some people deserve help and support and others don't. We say that help seeking is a good thing to do, that it's great, like reach out, ask for help. Yet when people do seek help, what they find is judgment. I have the Petri dish picture here because everybody who's ever heard me speak before has probably heard the Brene Brown quote about shame. And if you put shame in a Petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: silence, secrecy, and judgment. I think those are the pieces that we've been putting into our systems. And we know that that is just going to harm people more. It's creating toxic shame, toxic stress. It's creating inequality. And although in the short term, it's really clear that some people benefit from inequality and others don't, in the long term, it's my belief, and I know other people here believe, that this is bad for everybody. So I am going to stop right there and turn it over to Laurie. Laurie Ross, if you haven't heard of her before, the Dr. Laurie Ross is a professor at Clark University. She has also been contracted as the research partner for the city of Worcester. So she's really able to speak to these kind of macro systems level pieces. Thanks, Laurie. Ooh, that's a great graphic. Love it.
I tried, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm usually behind the scenes at Trauma Training Tuesday, and so I'm a little nervous. But what I'll be talking about, as the title says, hiding in plain sight, and it says the causes of inequity and youth violence, and I think it really stems from a lot comes out of what Amy was just saying. We think about the causes, but what we've been really thinking about, well, what's causing the causes? And we don't always look at that. And that's one of those hidden patterns that we want to pull out. I also want to just say that what I'll be sharing is very preliminary, and I'll explain a little more, but we've been working on an assessment all year of youth violence. And so these are very preliminary thoughts. There's nothing really final about this. And so I really do welcome your questions, your analysis on this, your experiences that will really actually help this process. We're going to be moving into more community meetings later this year. And so this is sort of a first showing. So, in the spirit of kind of breaking patterns, I'm going to start with the end. And the end is this really simple tagline that the community is the table. As we've been sketching out how to address issues around youth violence, this graphic, which basically starts with the way things are usually done and ends with a kind of a really new model, is that process of moving towards the community is the table. And it's not, even though the tagline is really simple, it's not a simple shift. And what is under here is that, we know a lot about youth violence. There's a lot of research on youth violence about what causes it. We understand, neighborhood conditions, child maltreatment, domestic violence, peer pressure, trauma, the media. there's a multiple list of things that cause, that have been found to cause youth violence. The community is the table came out of discussions that we've been having about, as I said, the causes of the causes. So what are the reasons underlying the reasons that we typically look at for youth violence? And so some of the very preliminary answers that we've gotten to this year are the ideas of trust, transparency, just what Amy said about resource distribution, and racial and ethnic representation. So basically the community as the table means that the right voices need to be at the right table. And so I'll walk through kind of how we got to this. All of this is coming out of what's called the Governance Council for Children, Youth, and Families. This is an effort that is co-chaired by the mayor and the city manager, and it consists of several different community initiatives, including the Worcester Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, Coalition for Healthy Greater Worcester, the Together for Kids Coalition. So 3 groups that basically have community-based plans, have a focus on equity, and are really focusing on the health and well-being of children, youth, and families. In addition to those coalitions, there's sectors of healthcare, business, funders, government, and both local government as well as county and state government who sit on this council. And every 3 years, we do an assessment of what's driving violence. And it's an iterative process, goes, starts with assessment, but the work's always happening, goes into planning, but assessing and working is always happening around addressing violence. We implement strategies, but we're assessing, implementing, and evaluating those strategies. And then again, we start assessing. So this is kind of an ongoing process. The 2021 assessment is taking place in a really unique context. It is taking place in a context around a kind of a racial reckoning in our nation. That the pandemic has created and really just brought to light so many inequities that so many people already knew about, but really has highlighted and one in particular is around child mental health services, which we're really grappling with. We have seen a spike in violence, and one context that needs to be known that maybe not everyone is as aware of is around criminal justice reform, and actually some areas around juvenile justice reform that have happened that have actually made it harder to arrest and punish youth, which is a force that's working towards what we're trying to achieve with reducing youth violence. But getting into some of the patterns, and these are some of the data that we look at, and I would be really interested in, kind of what you see, and feel free to either put in the chat what you see or just take yourself off mute. But this is the city of Worcester, and starting in 2015, when we really started the Youth Violence Initiative, and going till 2020. These are the number of gun and knife incidents involving youth and young adults in Worcester, so under the age of 25. So what do you see? Feel free to put in the chat if you see anything here.
A 2-year cycle.
Okay. Yep.
A good downward trend.
Great. So we see kind of a downward trend overall, with some times it flattens out and we see, less progress maybe. So here's some more data that we look at. You can see gun and knife incidents again for young people under the age of 25, same time period. Now you can see the ages of young people. And you can see the gender involved in these incidents. So again, what do you see?
In the first one, it seems to be more women that are involved, or ages involved in gun or knife incidents, versus a decrease of women that are involved in the years of 2015 to 2020 in the second box.
Great. Yeah. So what you can see is that, 18 to 25-year-olds tend to be involved in violence, in gun or knife incidents, more so than younger youth. and females tend to be less involved, and their involvement has been decreasing. So yes, one thing that you can't see, and that's one of the things that Amy and I work on, is that in the under 18 group, there are around 30 young people under the age of 10 actually who are involved in gun or knife incidents. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So another pattern that you can't necessarily see from looking at charts is that we know when we look at it by race and ethnicity, overall gun and knife incidents have declined by 36% or so over the time we've looked at. They've declined 50% for African American youth, 43% for Latino youth, and 64% for white youth. So they're declining faster for white youth, which is interesting. We also know that when we look at the data that and compare young people by race and ethnicity, that Black and Latinx youth are 6 times more likely than white youth to be involved in a gun or knife incident as a victim, witness, or perpetrator. And so going on to the next slide, if I can go on to the next slide, is showing a pattern that we don't often think about and see when we think about young people in gun and knife incidents. And that what this is showing is that all of what I just talked about with gun and knife incidents actually includes youth that were arrested, charged, or suspects, but also young people who are victims or witnesses. And so the vast majority actually of young people involved in gun and knife incidents are victims and witnesses, and actually around 80% of all of it. So like the number of youth that are actually committing the violence is very small, but we also know that there are patterns of retaliation that happen in these kinds of situations. And we also know that Worcester has tried to institute some interventions to break cycles, victim perpetration cycles, which have gone underutilized for reasons that have been a little bit confusing to understand. And we'll talk more about that later too. So we entered the 2021 assessment thinking about all these things and having this basic information. And we knew that if we kept seeing this persistent inequity and we saw this number of young people as victims and witnesses, that doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results would basically be Einstein's definition of insanity. And actually worse than that, because if we keep doing that, we're complicit in maintaining the status quo that is disproportionately hurting youth of color. And so what do we need to do differently? We looked at even the word assessment, and we didn't realize what it means is actually to sit beside. And that informed the approach that we took with the 2021 assessment. How do we actually sit beside community as we look at the reasons why inequity persists? And so some of the ways this assessment was different is what we really tried to do is move away from a deficit and risk factor approach to one that has been developed in collaboration with community. And so we had a group of men who work with young people who are involved in violence in various ways, who collaborated with us all along the way on this assessment. What questions we should ask, who we should talk to. They invited us into their spaces to kind of see the work that they do on a day-to-day basis. We also were really informed by a book called Emergent Strategy, which was incredible, very powerful and very healing for the people involved in doing the assessment, as well as a book called The Power Manual, which is really about an analysis of power in this kind of work. We worked with Josh Croak from Action by Design, who helped facilitate workshops with us to really get different voices and different kinds of questions involved in the assessment. And so just starting with a basic definition of what is youth violence. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, defines youth violence as the intentional use of physical force or power to threaten or harm others by young people aged 10 to 24. Youth violence can include fighting, bullying, threats with weapons, and gang-related violence. A young person can be involved with youth violence as a victim, offender, or witness. So it's a pretty basic definition. What we did with the assessment is we tried to understand what violence means to community members. And so we really oriented who we talked to towards people who are closer to the issue than perhaps we had done in the past. And what we learned was that, yes, violence is a physical act, but we also learned that violence is a lack of safety, and violence is also not being understood or supported. And so I'll just read to you these quotes. So one young person, one of our collaborators said, "I was talking to a kid a couple of weeks ago and I was like, yo, how did you get involved?" He said he came from Boston and he started hanging around guys in Plumley because he met them at school. All of a sudden, the guys from South Side associated him being in that crew. And every time they'd ask him, he would say, "No, I'm not East Side." But it all changed when he was walking home and a group of guys jumped him. He was like, yo, if they're already associating me with these guys, then I might as well get down and have some protection and go to war with them. So that's something you hear. It's not a choice. They're forced into it. They run to the streets for protection. Another person said, "It's all ongoing. It's just a matter of limited resources for all the staff. There's limited amount of resources for cultural awareness or better understanding of mental health. Sometimes trainings are just trainings, a huge lack of resources for that. And youth can quickly identify when their teachers don't understand where they're coming from and what they're feeling." And so both of the things that I just said can sound like causes of violence, but these were actually seen by our informants as violence. When young people don't have access to safety, that is violence perpetrated against them. When they don't have access to resources and people, that is violence as well. And so we talked a lot about the causes of violence as being a lack of support, a lack of safety net, a lack of services and things like that. But I just want to really convey that these lacks are seen in and of themselves as violence. And so getting at that and sort of this question of, we have a pretty deep understanding of what violence is. We understand somewhat about the consequences of violence. And we have understanding from the research about what causes violence. But the question is really then what causes the causes. And so I'll just go into a few of the themes that we learned about. The first one being punitive policies and practices. One person said there are a lot of guns out there and kids are using them, and we can't deny that. But we also know that punishment in and of itself is actually not going to reduce recidivism or make anyone more safe. We really have to figure out a different way. Another thing that causes the causes is funding that maintains the status quo. And so someone said, for the young men I work with, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order for them to build the level of responsibility, the way of thinking when it comes to just showing up for programming. Like real talk, the young people that we're working with historically are not good for your summer youth work model. The funders need certain results to say X% entered, X% came out, they ended up going on to do this. And so if they're going to continue to see that that's not happening, the funders aren't going to take that risk. They're going to take the risk with someone who's more likely to complete than not. And when the young people we're working with, they are less likely to complete. So funding that maintains the status quo. The next theme that came out were that leaders listen with their mouth instead of their ears. And this was conveyed, in different ways. And this quote exemplifies that. Don't be worried about, well, these are all the good things we've done. If you're going to listen, you have to listen. Don't go into the meeting saying, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. It sounds defensive and who cares? It's not enough. So please listen to people. That's where it starts. You may not be able to do everything. You may not even agree, but let's engage in some real earnest conversation and dialogue. There's two more. Trust and transparency. This first quote came from young people. They said, if you want me to trust you, I got to make sure you trust me. And so the young people that we spoke with didn't feel like they walk around their worlds with feeling that the worlds around them trust them. And so they were pretty clear that they choose to be in the places where they feel that trust. And then on the community side of things, there was a lot of conversations around areas where there just wasn't transparency in decision-making. And this quote exemplifies that. There's no transparency. That's not part of the process. So like when ShotSpotter, when that happened, people mobilized around that issue. and it had already been decided. They were just deciding how much they were going to spend on it. So people are protesting things that have already been decided and they didn't know about it. Even the funding for the police budget to increase last year, folks were up in arms. Folks were calling in for 2 to 3 hours of public testimony, but the police were going to get it. And so this is seen as something that's really exhausting to community, to be in these battles when decisions are basically already made. And then finally, the last theme that I'll talk about now is idea of proximity and representation. So one person said, you see how the kids act out when they get angry? I was one of those kids. I was one of those kids. I didn't give anyone an opportunity to sit down and talk to me. I wanted to hurt everyone and anybody who felt that they were close to me. And that's why I know what these kids are doing. I can see it. You know what I'm saying? You know, it's really about how much effort we put into sitting down with the kids. So proximity is the idea of the people who understand are the ones who are the closest to it and who can kind of hold the young people in their minds and hearts all the time, maybe because they were the young person at one time. And then also was said, so you look at the district, majority of the teachers that are in the district are white. Yes, we're seeing more minorities now. Yes, we're seeing more Latinos, more Black people. You're seeing more of these people taking roles in the community. But this, in my opinion, needed to happen 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I appreciate it's happening now, that they're given more opportunities, not to take away from the work that anyone is doing or puts in these situations. But this is just putting the Band-Aid back on to what the community ripped off. And this, to me, is like a very, very deep idea where, and it goes back to the transparency issue, where whenever community seems to sort of be getting maybe a narrative changing, this idea of the Band-Aid goes back on and kind of hides it again. So I've just been thinking about that line like a lot over and over, and there's a lot of depth there. So, you know, again, going back to this idea of the causes that speak, that the causes of the causes, the few things I mentioned, you know, punitive policies and practices, funding that maintains the status quo, leaders that listen with their mouth instead of their ears, trust and transparency, proximity and representation. And there is more, and there's a lot more for us to work on. But the bottom line is to see the patterns. The community basically has to be the table. And what we mean by that is the right voices are the individuals with lived experience, in this case of violence, but in other cases, whoever has that lived experience. The people who know the neighborhoods, who have deep and ongoing relationships with young people and their families, who they themselves have experienced the causes of the causes. The right tables are the places and times where real decisions are made. And so this is what we're looking at as kind of a new form of governance, where it's not to say that leaders are being displaced. It's really about new forms of partnership where we work together and kind of learn and respect each other's knowledge and experience. It will require acknowledgement of past harms so that healing can happen, but this is kind of where we're hoping we can move to.
Laurie, that was amazing. That was so beautifully connected to the idea of, and one of the things that struck me is, you know, we traumatize people and then they have symptoms like they're mad or they're sad, and then we continue to punish them for being traumatized. And again, and I love that you kind of picked up on that piece about like we're going to be back here in 10 years if we don't do anything. Like, are we really just going to keep on going back and doing what we've been doing? And now we're going to, like, not only are we going to get the same results, it's going to be worse, right? That's how trauma works. You try to not look at it, you try to pretend it's not there, and then it has to hit you harder, like, for you to wake up. So I'm hoping that we wake up, that the pandemic, we can make meaning from the sort of pain we've all been in by using it as the wake-up call we need. I don't know if you, Laurie, if you had questions to frame to the audience, or if people, I mean, it was so, I love that someone else picked up on your point about the past harms.
Yeah, I don't have any specific questions other than I'm very curious to know if this resonates. Like, does it make sense? What in your own experiences should be acknowledged, in this? Like, as I said, this will be a report that goes to that governance council I mentioned. And so just very curious, people's reactions and, questions.
Well, let me open. Hi. For me, one of the main points that I really appreciated was you collaborating with groups of people who had already been in that situation. And I think that a lot of researchers, I know in the past, I think that a lot of researchers completely miss that. And I think that that is a huge part of what needs to be involved.
It was absolutely the most valuable part of it. In a lot of ways, the process changes all of us when we work together in it. And so, our collaborators, it was done in a class. And so, we would, the bonds between the students and the collaborators grew in ways that I would never have imagined. And, going back to emergent strategy and the whole idea of the fractal, which is like the smallest, what we do at the smallest radiates out to the largest. And so we kind of thought, if we need to build the kinds of relationships we want among ourselves in order for that to become part of the way our community works. And so the collaboration was the most important part of the whole thing, really.
I think that you raised the thing that many people here have observed in whatever content they have, is that people making decisions are not the impacted people. And that's pretty much what Deborah was saying as well. Like, people that are making decisions, they're making decisions for other people, and the people that are most impacted, that the harm is done to those, that's who they're not at the table. And I think I learned that from you kind of earlier on, that if it's a bunch of white women making policies, who benefits the most is, without even our intention, without trying, is white women, young, people. We all come to the table with our lived experience, and we can't not put that into how we show up. And as we've learned through many of the trauma trainings, people's ability to show up as their full selves is really curtailed by racism, sexism, like all heterosexism, all these things that have happened make it so people can't get to the table. Definitely one of my biggest learnings, like, when you are traumatized, you're down. You're not advocating for other people. Like, you can't do that if you're not there yourself. So it just really, you can see how these things really feed into each other, and it just continues and continues.
I was going to say too, this is Jessica. I think what we know
Jess, we couldn't
about trauma is that when something who's supposed to be helpful.
Can you repeat?
The first time we go,
couldn't hear you. Your Zoom went out for a second there, so I didn't hear what you said.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just thinking, when something traumatic does happen to us, the people that we go to in our communities, or that we're expected to go to, who are supposed to be helpful to us, if they are kind and encouraging, and help us problem solve, then that, reduces the symptoms of the trauma. But if we go and we get punishment or judgment or abuse in response, then we're not going to ask for help again. And I think, generations of those who are supposed to be helped by, responding in judgment and punishment has caused us to stop asking for help. I can see my last job that I worked in, at youth villages, I worked with young people coming out of foster care. And they had a lot of outcomes, including violence, right? And I think that a lot of that to be safe in their life were those that were kind of giving judgments, and there was oppression and abuse in the system that was supposed to be caring for them. So I could definitely see that in that population.
Thank you, Jess.
My name is Sherelle, and I was gonna add that the name of it being Causes of Causes is extremely important because it gives a broad, view on, what's, it highlights, it almost already apologizes and acknowledges the past as being a focal point, as well as I think as a community basis, sometimes it's almost like you said, a band-aid when we acknowledge, okay, well, we've moved this far already, or this is where we are. We have a lot of African American and Latinos, but I think that there still needs to be work at acknowledging that, this is for real. I think some people almost kind of see it as a facade or as a, not necessarily what it is, that our times have changed so much. So I think that kind of implementing that in a different way to the community, kind of, just as way of saying like, no, hey, things are really changing, would go a long way. Even maybe as a visual, or as you said, people coming to the table who have experienced the same things or who have lived through a different time. I always say, elders pretty much, to come and say, no, hey, listen, things, or people that they trust already or know already, it sets a different tone for the community to just be able to kind of relate to and understand and accept that they can be a part of what they kind of felt excluded from before. And it makes it a lot more comfortable for them to feel like they can be a part of something that may have not, they may have felt excluded from in the past. I think that is a very important time that we're in now to be able to do that. So that's great.
Yeah, I really, because so much of what people talked about were like so many different kinds of barriers that prevent authentic participation in processes, right? And so I love the way you're talking about that the people at the table essentially need to be the people that are trusted, and sort of breaking some of those barriers down. I think that really resonates with what we heard.
Yeah, that was so beautiful. And it made me think when you were talking about, the story behind the story, like we start the story, it's like we punch you and then we start the story at you being punched as if that's the beginning of the story. And like, what do you expect from like, oh, we left that part out, that the reason you're, harmed, traumatized, like, well, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about your behavior from here. And how often do we do, like, we don't tell entire stories. We tell a story that fits what we want to fund, or like who's there, all of those things. Whew, that's like some deep, good stuff. I'm really, and Eve, I love your comment in the chat about just looking at these sort of buckets and elevating the voices, and the lived experience just really comes through as being something that's been really missing from how we set up our systems in the first place. Dr. Castile is in clinic. She is not able to be here. But I'm really happy we have Reverend Payson here. If I don't know if anyone else wanted to speak to what Laurie specifically had. I know these will the themes will continue. And I know that Aaron, if anybody who knows me has heard me talk about Aaron, because he always, like, his way of seeing things, the way he puts things is always so based in justice and kindness. And he has been huge. Like he did our very first training with just thinking about the life cycle of a pandemic. The last most helpful thing that you said to me, Erin, was about this is more like being in war, right? There's not like this clear end in sight, like COVID's done. It's really just going and gonna keep going. And you just always have a lot of really helpful ways of thinking of things. So I'm just super psyched you're here and you are gonna speak to this esoteric theme.
I am, and I lied. I do have slides, if I can find them.
Stacey,
Can you
I
all?
want to comment too.
Well,
We got you. It
let me
looks like you're
pull
sharing.
these. Yep. So I want to go back to, and this is really a wonderful kind of. I hope that this is really very much in tune with what Dr. Ross has been talking about, because you just talked about narrative, and I think that on some level, what Dr. Ross is really talking about is whose narrative are we focusing on? Are we listening to the people who are most impacted as the primary experts of what is happening and how we solve those kinds of things? And it takes me back to the work that I've done with communities for years. And I want to reiterate what we talked about earlier, and that is that trauma is fundamentally focused on individual response, when in fact, part of the real learning from the work that Laurie and her class and the coalition that has been brought together in the city has been talking about is the role and responsibility of community in relationship to violence itself. And so I'm going to go back to this concept of the community of survivors and this notion of sacred ambiguity. That's part of our work. And the notion comes from this issue that when traumatic things happen and when people have been traumatized for generations and years, and also having individual experiences of trauma, narratives form. And when you're talking about a particular incident of trauma, you have these micro narratives that form about this is what happened to me. And those micro narratives start to coalesce into a more general narrative depending on what part of the community you're in. And it's a layered experience, right? It's the people who experienced it, in person, and then it's the people who were told about it by the people who experienced it in person, and the people who were told about it in a tertiary fashion, all the way up to what ends up being remembered as history, if you will, over the time. And that part of what is, I think, that we're responsible for as a community is learning how to craft narratives that honor the spectrum of micro narratives that are out there that can be very different depending on what an individual experienced and what they're bringing to that experience, the histories that they represent in this, and how that informs what they experienced as a part of this. So the idea of sacred ambiguity is the ability for communities to live with the spectrum of experience instead of having to craft a narrative that speaks to only one facet of the experience, only one dynamic of the experience. And leaders worth their salt understand how to respond to this spectrum of experience by acknowledging the reality of each individual experience without claiming that one experience is definitive for everyone. And I'm going to go back up to this is really the relationship between personal and communal violence. And this was part of a presentation that I did for ministers a couple of days ago, interestingly enough. And where it very much parallels what Dr. Ross was talking about is on the top half of this slide, we spent a lot of time talking about the symptomatic response by individuals who experience trauma and how we work with those individuals. But beyond that is this whole realm of community that involves three facets, right? The people in community, the issue of the socioeconomic reality of that community, and the sense of place that people have in community. So in relationship to people itself, it's really about looking at the way in which people are either connected or disconnected to the wider reality that they share with others. And that we're often dealing with histories of damaged relationships. And I'm not just talking about familial relationships here. I'm really talking about the essence of what you all have been discussing, which is the lack of trust that is built into the system when people are ignored over their own lifetime or over generations. The destructive social norms that were named earlier, in the sense that when you have a lack of opportunity or a lack of invitation to be involved in processes, that these also are demonstrative of trauma in community, and that there's a low sense of political and social efficacy, which is really about social power. And we know that narratives are fundamentally serve the function of of both the maintenance of the integrity of human experience, but they are often co-opted in order to maintain power and control. And so we see different narratives vying for allegiance by people in the community or leadership, largely because those narratives often get connected with resources and with reputations that end up shaping future kinds of engagement. Then we have equitable opportunity, which is really about the reality of intergenerational poverty. It's about the reality of unemployment. It's about the reality of the disinvestment in community itself, or in particular places in community. Who gets the resources to redo their roads or for the communal infrastructure that people literally live with? Do they feel like the place that they are inhabiting is a place that they want to inhabit, or a place that they're only forced to inhabit because they're not given access to anything else? And then the issue of place itself, the deteriorating environments that people are often forced to inhabit, the unhealthy and dangerous public spaces themselves, and the crumbling environment. I came to Worcester after having spent 8 years in southern Ohio, in rural Ohio. And, one of the things that happens in rural Ohio is there's a lot of flooding. And it happens up and down the estuaries to the Ohio River. And the communities that are disproportionately and always impacted by that are the communities that are built on the land that is the cheapest. And the land that is cheapest was essentially those on floodplains. And so we're talking about, in the absence of any kind of public investment in creating housing opportunities for people in that part of the world that didn't consistently put them at risk. They were the ones who were consistently experiencing over generations the vulnerability of their belongings and the vulnerability of their lives in relationship to this. And you add to that the history of the way in which water is controlled by municipalities and others who are most powerful, and the desecration of natural barriers to flooding. And you see how communities themselves are put in significant put in harm's way in significant fashion. and this just doesn't happen in flooded communities. This happens in communities where you see significant divestment in public education, in the infrastructure available. It happens in areas where you see food deserts, you name it. This is the way in which communities actually reflect the reality of trauma and are continually traumatized. And it is the stuff that individuals bring to their experience of traumatic events that often gets left out of the narratives. And the way in which it often gets spun in public spaces by those who do not understand the important role of these narratives is that they get framed as excuses by those who want to diminish the power and potential of these kinds of histories in service to healing in the community. They see it as a deflection of responsibility when in fact it is actually the naming of what we need to be most responsible for as a larger community. And it means putting those people who have been made most vulnerable at the center of the conversation and giving them the resources and acknowledging the power that they can invest in determining their future. For those of you who are interested in some of this, Susan Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, is a wonderful reflection on the way in which indigenous responses to natural disasters are actually far more effective than governmental responses. And it's largely because the power to transform community is invested by and invested in the people who are fundamentally going to live out that communal reality over time and generations, instead of people who move in to fix a particular situation or respond to a situation and then move out again. And it's interesting that those particular kinds of responses in community, if you look at them over generations, end up becoming the impetus for political change, ultimately. Because people who experience this kind of investment in responsibility, resources, and their knowledge, their power is acknowledged, end up feeling like they can actually make more substantive change over time. So what Dr. Ross is talking about from my standpoint, even though it begins with this vision of how do we understand youth violence, is really fundamentally about how it is that we transform communities and how we invest in leadership, and how we place, where we invest our energy in understanding the origin of the narrative that is larger than any particular incident itself. And I'll stop there.
That was so, wow. I love that you really brought it back to the sort of trauma symptoms and just, wow, that was so much, right? It so lines up, and it was, of course, beautifully brought back to overarching themes. Thank you. Other people in the, I don't know if people had prepared content, and honestly, Erin, that might even be a beautiful segue to hear from Edie Rivera, who's working for Legendary Legacies now. And that's sort of a group and an agency that is, I think they're just trying to do things right. They're starting now, so they get to start with an ideal or a much kind of better framework for how to do this than sort of, this is how we've always done it and we're just going to keep on doing it and band-aid it. I don't know if I was putting you on the spot or if you're good to go. You look gorgeous, by the way.
No, thank you. So basically, we were lucky to get this amazing grant to help Black and Latino males For now, hopefully someday we'll be able to branch out and also have female services as well. But basically the service is we are helping, are taking a different approach for most reentry programs because we are into our services, and not so much as just services to our participants, but also as the work culture. So everything that we're doing is everything is a CBT, and we're also taking the approach of trauma and heard, because sometimes they don't feel like they're being heard, and a lot of and the staff is to the staff in terms of the staff is very diverse as well, which is, I know participants say that want to engage in services with
Your Zoom is really kind of
people that they're not comfortable with. Can you hear me?
I don't know. You've kind of been going
It's
in and out,
probably
or out.
super. I don't know if it's because of the room I'm in. It's super echoey. So I don't know if that has something to do with it.
It's not, it's like, I think it's more connectivity. I don't know. I couldn't even hear you for a lot of it, which I'm bummed about. But I love that you brought it to workplace environment too. I think that's a really important piece. So I don't even know what to do about sort of your connectivity stuff, because from looking at people's faces, it looked like most people couldn't hear what you said. I don't know if you want to type out some stuff. That's kind of like not the best case scenario.
No. I can, yeah.
I'm sorry. It's such a bummer.
Yeah, I mean, I can. Sure.
Okay. Whatever.
So I'm sorry.
That's the Zoom gods. That's not on you. Bradley, Paulette, I don't know if either you wanted to speak to this, or if there's other people that had some prepared content, maybe people from Health and Human Services, if you wanted to offer any observations, if your Zoom's not bouncing out, jump right in, feel free.
I completely agree that there are a lot more African Americans in the healthcare field, and in like psychiatry and therapy, and it's gradually gonna make a difference. But I think that it's already made a huge difference. Like I said, sometimes it's really hard to see that things have caught up as quickly as they have, but it's not what it was yesterday. So I think that the difference is there, and it's notable, and it's made a difference in the community thus far.
Thank you. That was helpful. You've had some really great things to say. Other people, it looked like somebody was ready to jump in, and then it's so hard to pick up on cues of who's jumping in. Laurie, John had a comment way back about, and I don't know if it's anything you could speak to, but just the idea of universal income or somehow addressing inequality financially. I don't know that you could speak to that, but if anybody has thoughts about that or about any solutions or things that we feel like are really missing in how systems have been organized. Oh, and Catherine, I love that you responded to the funding pieces too, because definitely that was one thing that I hadn't thought of until Dr. Ross just raised it about funders really, and one of the comments of the kids was related to that too. Like what they want is these sort of really clear outcomes. And in the world of mental health, we don't always have benchmarks, and it's relational, it's process focused. I think anybody who does work in behavioral health or teaching, we know that it's about how you do it as much as about what you're doing and your endpoints. Yet we're always assessed by end goals, not by process. It seems like so many of the pieces people raised today were about process, how we come to the ways we're doing things, and the fact that it's a small group setting up these kinds of systems and ideas about what's going to work.
I think it's the community that has to be, patient with the providers. I think that if both acknowledge the patience and the effort that it takes as well, that's been given, I think that our overall goal is that much more effective. But I think, again, acknowledging that yesterday wasn't the same as today, as wasn't the same as last week, that there's absolutely much progress being made, it really makes all the difference, because things change within a minute, within an hour, within a second. And I think that change builds up to a year worth of change, and we're living presently in history, as the past was living through their history as well. So I think that just acknowledging that and seeing it in real time makes it all much the more effective.
Nice. Where all the baby noises are like, Bradley. Brad, I can't hear you either. Oh no. Not very well, but yeah, it sounds like your speaker's not really picking you up, or what you got there.
Is that better?
Yes, that's lovely.
I have a new computer, and so obviously I haven't made all my adjustments yet. So thanks for helping me with that. Both presentations were amazing, and the one thing that I think the pandemic has shown us, part of the problem is that communally we're obsessed with pathology, and the pathology creates division. And we sort our problems out as to, I've experienced this, but I haven't experienced this, and it creates a problem, especially when we have some shadow projection, when we're looking at, well, they're more screwed up than I am. And I think the pandemic has shown us all that it's brought us all to the brink of coping. And everyone has their own problems, but I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that we all have our own problems. And Amy, you've heard me say many, many times that that we're all broken. So if we're all broken, then we're all normal. And we have to quit pathologizing everyone and just and creating this division, this separation, and get this communal ideology. We're all dealing with our own stuff here, and that gives a semblance that'll create a stronger community, and more people will either help or not hurt, which includes the judgment. And the inequality is a psychological construct that we create. If someone has more money than someone else, we create that further division. So I don't know how to do it other than reframing the perception and creating this awareness through education that we're all fallible, we're all human, we're all struggling, we're all fighting our own private battle. And the two things you can do is either help someone or not hurt someone, and try to eradicate some of this judgment and help lift other people up, or just let other people help other people and lift them up, and stop this division. The division has gotten so bad in this country, in this community, and it's always been here, right? It's part of a human construct, but we should, it's 2021, we should have evolved way farther than how we've evolved now. We have to start healing some of this division. And my hope is that it has gotten so bad and in the last 5 or 6 years, and that this pandemic has brought us to the brink where more people than not will agree that we need to do something differently, that we are all in this together, and that from an equality standpoint, if we want to talk about financial inequality, the people at the bottom hold this entire system up. It's not the people at the top, and there's power at the bottom. The problem is that someone who makes $40,000, I know people make $40,000 a year that look down on people that make $20,000 a year, and idolize people that make $100 million a year, and that you have more in common with that person that makes $20,000 a year or less than you ever will with someone who makes that kind of money. And we need to heal that rift in our communities. And I'm rambling. I'm repeating myself. But we have to create this awareness and get away from this pathology and just breaking everyone down and creating all this division and work together to heal this community.
I think you raise a really important piece, though, that's where this is all coming from, right? Like this, we're all coming to this from this place of pain and exclusion. And I think that's I think there's some intention to dividing people because of what you said, that if we did all come together and say, hey, this isn't really, these systems, the child welfare system, for example, isn't really working well for anybody. Let's do something with that. But we've been, I think it's a strategy employed by people in power to say, you know what, that's the person who's messing with you. It's not the people up there. It's the people like just below, like right at your level and maybe less than. And that's who you should really focus your anger and your observation on. And I feel like that's just a big piece of what's happening, and that people benefit from these systems. Like, this isn't a benign thing. There are people that clearly benefit from the way the systems are now. And I don't think that's really anybody who's on this screen right now. These systems were not designed to help regular people. Like, and just, yeah, what are we going to do with this? And we cannot let this moment go with just going to repeat the same old things. It's just way too painful to participate in harming people. Hi. Oh, sorry about that. I don't know if anybody has thoughts about that or wants to respond to just their thinking about how this is not even visible. I often talk about sort of the mental health system and the challenges of the mental health system. And people will say again and again, I can't navigate this system. It's not, I think that's also intentional. There's no place you can go where you can find out, there's no roadmap, right? And that means we don't, if people can't navigate the system, we never have to help them if they never even get there. And that's challenging.
I think hopefully you can hear me now. I'm not, maybe with the video being off. But I think part of that is that systemic oppression, right? It's making a lot of these systems harder to get to, making things a lot more difficult for people to succeed. And sometimes, it kind of plays off into their confidence as well, and making them feel inferior, right? So I think that based on what you were saying, Bradley, it just sounds like there's a lot of systemic oppression that kind of creates the problem that we're in right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The solution eventually becomes part of the problem. I think that's true of most human organizations in itself. And when you take programs and you make them statewide or federal wide, you've taken the personal connection out of them. From a communal standpoint, when we look back hundreds of years ago, communities revolved around the church, and the church was actively involved in the community. Everyone knew. So people were essentially working together through the church to help each other through the community. And we've certainly lost that. And I don't mean to make this any type of religious conversation. I'm just speaking from a factual historical vantage point.
Preach it, brother.
I'm sorry?
I said, preach it, brother.
Thank you, Reverend Payson. We've just lost that human touch. So when someone has to go to their county office and speak with someone who's just doing their job and they're struggling to get by, and they have this pathological viewpoint that this person's here to take advantage of the system in and of itself, because they become hardened. They see these people day after day after day. We've taken that personal connection out. It's just, we're going through the motions at that point. I wish I had a solution. I feel like I'm complaining about something without offering a solution. But
we said we weren't going to get to any solutions. We're just talking problems. You don't have to come up with solutions, Bradley Hall. No worries. But yeah, Reverend Payson, that exactly when you said like indigenous responses to disasters end up being long-term much more effective. That really resonated with what Brad was just saying too, this idea that people impacted are going to have better long-term solutions than people that are not as impacted or that are from outside the community. And wow, that's a big point of learning, meaning making. Why are we still in this place where we just keep getting directions from above? And
well, that was kind of my point with the pathologizing. People who've been through the same thing can identify. So there is no judgment there. There's no separation. It's inclusion. But if someone who has never struggled financially, they have been conditioned that someone who's struggling financially is a deadbeat and not worth anything. That creates that separation and that judgment. And then the judgment is adopted by the person who's in that situation. They can feel that someone's judging them. They in turn judge themselves because they accept the projection onto them. And that's kind of what I was getting to say with the pandemic. I think we can all, through the pandemic, we can all stop and say that we've had our own issues dealing with different issues, but it's brought us all to the forefront that we can all identify that everyone's struggling, and use that as a jumping off point, as a starting point to stop being so judgmental and looking down on other people and projecting our own stuff onto other people, and just allow. That's why I was saying that you don't have to help them, just don't hurt them. Just stop interfering with other people, helping other people. Kind of mind your own business and help yourself and help your own people if that's what you need to do. But we've got way too much judgment and interference going on that prevents people from getting on their own feet.
The system's actually completely about judgment. If you're looking, many of these systems are about judgment. You're coming to the system because you've been judged, and we're going to continue to judge by what I think. If I'm the person judging by what I think is good parenting or good environmental management or good anything, we're not questioning like, why do you get to decide what the right way to do things is? And then the whole system is who deserves help, who doesn't. I'm often wondering, like, how much do we spend on deciding if we're going to help people? And we have this great fear that people are taking advantage of these systems. I have yet to meet a person who has scored big in any of these systems. Like, I don't see how they advantage anyone. They do a lot of judging. And, you know, Brad, what you said was the other part of the Brene quote about shame in a petri dish, that the empathy is the antidote. If we actually connect and hear each other, that was a big thing in Laurie's presentation. Listening, don't talk, like, hear their stories, like, believe them, believe what they're saying about their experience. How about we do that instead of just judging? It would be a really different world if we were actually trying to help. I wonder how much we really are.
Well, I believe in it. I believe sometimes to make a point, you have to use exaggerate to make a point well. Unfortunately, this story isn't an exaggeration. I recently saw someone on Facebook who is a part-time Uber driver. Now, Amy, you know me very well. I don't ever admonish anyone for whatever they need to do to survive. So this isn't about her profession or demeaning her profession. It's about the rant that she went on about that the problems with employment, because low-wage jobs are struggling to hire because of the demand that we've seen for wage earners. People have a choice, I mean, where they want to work. She said that people aren't filling jobs because people are lazy, and which we've all heard repeatedly. But she pointed out how much money all these people taking advantage of the system have made in stimulus payments and unemployment checks over the last year. Now, I'm like everyone else in my finances. I'm a normal person in my finances. I don't know where the logic is to think that anyone, her exact words, they got rich off of the stimulus payments and the unemployment. Now, I don't know. And this is in the state of Florida. So, state of Florida, the maximum on unemployment is $250. You add in the I think it was $300 a week the federal government threw in there. So we're talking if someone maximized, and I don't know what the length of unemployment is. I just want to do some quick math here. Even if it was a year, $25,000 plus a couple of stimulus payments, I don't know that that qualifies anybody to be rich, even if they invested all $30,000. But this person, who probably makes $15,000 a year because she only works part-time as an Uber driver, was condemning these people who got rich. Someone has convinced her that someone making $30,000 is elite and oppressive and that kind of thing. My point is they have conditioned her so strongly that her statements are absolutely ridiculous. But she's so caught up in it, like we talked about. She needs something, an intervention to step back and take a different vantage point and increase her awareness. And that's the only way the empathy can come through, is changing her vantage point. Unfortunately, media thrives off the division. So they're real good at conditioning people and people buying into their narrative to be able to keep the division. It sells commercials and generates votes, and that's what people are looking for. But we just have to see things differently. We just have to.
Really nicely put. If we ever started with the baseline that all people are valuable and have equal value, we wouldn't have these pieces, right? Because we start with this belief that we don't have the same value as other people, and our value is determined by arbitrary things over which we have no control, then we are always wanting to find somebody who's less than. It's a pretty sick underpinning. And I often ask people, I often wonder if it's even possible to be mentally healthy in our culture with kind of what we put out there, with what we value, with what we don't value, the level at which what we say and what we do are so different, right? It's overwhelming. And I think I've seen again and again that no system is exempt from this. They all have inequality baked right in. The trauma of food insecurity. They were talking about our decision trees on who we were going to give food stamps to were intentionally to exclude women of color. Like that's how it was set up, to exclude them. So we ask them a bunch of questions and find ways we can judge them so we don't have to help them. And then that villainizing we do when we don't help people, when we harm people, instead of looking at the ways we've harmed people, we just want to say why they deserve it. And we're just really on a path of social destruction. And if we need to shift it and be constructive.
If I can just highlight, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm pretty sick, but
thank you.
You can hear my voice. You really hit on the word, and what I was thinking about when Bradley was speaking to was about values. So people being aware of truly what your own values are. So I'm a life coach, and I've done the values elicitation activity. I've done it corporately. You know, I have a corporate job. I work for a city as well, but really looking at what's important to me and then looking at my life. So whether or not you're working in a field where you're helping others. So I get it. I live in Canada. I have a friend and her ex-husband who work in social services. And I mean, the skewed vision that he has, I can't even imagine being a client coming to him for help, because he's clearly been impacted by all the stuff he's seen. And now he has that skewed lens. So doing those activities within your workplace, what do you value and how do you actually enact those values in what you do, whether it's work, you know, whether you're involved in your church, whatever those activities are you living those values? So in the work that you do and how you approach and talk to people. So I'm getting old. I guess it was over 30 years ago. I was thinking when Bradley was speaking, I lived in a geared to income neighborhood. I'm not sure what that's called in the States, but basically my parents were very poor. So our income our rent was based on our income. We moved into that neighborhood when I was like 11. So I'd been in, I was a rich kid moving into the neighborhood. We were never rich, but because we had a house and a car and I had a dad, I was considered a rich kid moving into the poor neighborhood. My brother and I had blonde hair and, we kind of stayed out of trouble, well-behaved children, and we moved into this neighborhood. And it was interesting trying to navigate our way. So violence was an issue. So we learned very quickly who to make friends with, whose side to sort of be on, so that we sort of, stayed on the good side and weren't getting beat up every week. And then once we became teenagers and we needed money, getting a job was actually really hard because of my address. So thankfully, this lovely man moved into our neighborhood. It's unfortunate he was in a financial situation, but he had the heart and the lens to look at, there was a group of us between 11 and 15, including his children, that he saw as high risk. And he was like, we need to do something. So he kept talking to us, and he's like, you're kind of a nerdy kid, come here and talk to me. And he came up with this idea to get us working. So we did some programs in the neighborhood, but he also had us, he hired someone from the employment center to work with us to find us jobs. So basically someone went out on our behalf to say, hey, you need to give these kids a break. They're from a bad neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. So we had an opportunity to work in jobs that probably we thought no one would ever give us. So I ended up working for our provincial government. So you'd be state in the States. I never would have had a chance to do that job. But the person who was running the program said, I don't understand why you kids haven't been working at, and I'll insert the fast food restaurant we all lived behind, why you're not all working there. And I'm like, I'll show you. And so literally I said, tomorrow, can I go in there and can we take a couple of our resumes? So 3 of us went in, we handed in our resume, didn't get a call. And I said to him, next week, I'm going to put down my friend's address. She lives in a nice neighborhood. I live in a small enough city that that's a nice neighborhood. Everybody has a pool. So I put her address on. I got a call the next day. The help wanted sign was there the whole time. It's not like they weren't hiring. I went in for my interview and I actually already had a job because I was working for our MPP, our municipal government, our provincial government. And I said, you know what? I don't want this job. I actually live behind, and our neighborhood had a bad name. It was called Boomtown. And I said, I'm actually a Boomtown kid. And last week I handed in my resume with that address and you didn't call me. I don't want this job, but please give us a break. Some of us are really nice kids and we're not going to cause any problems. We just need a job. So I walked out and I was like shaking and nervous. I finally stood up for myself, as a kid. But I don't know, like, I hope that that experience did something to change that manager's view, but just an address was enough to keep us out. And for the person who was running the program, it really opened up his eyes. He was like, wow, so it didn't matter what I looked like. It didn't matter who I spoke to. Whoever saw that, saw where I lived, which was right behind, and said, not a chance. So if someone didn't come into the community and see that and believe in us, and he lived his values, he was retired, but he put his heart and soul into it. And I ran some programs afterwards as well. And we always sat down and said, what is it that we want to do? So, we based our programs based on what the needs were. And we went and knocked on people's doors. He sent me to the doors because he was affiliated with a church and there wasn't a whole lot of love for religion in my neighborhood at the time. So I knocked on the doors and I asked people what they wanted so that, they had that friendly face of that kid in the neighborhood to see what people needed. And then we tried to base programs based on what people said they needed. And again, it wasn't just about handing people things. We had kids working in a vegetable garden. We had them cleaning up the environment. We were teaching them how to make basic meals. Like, it's great that they know how to get to the food cupboard, but then they get food home and sometimes nobody knew how to cook it, or mom or dad were drunk and they weren't cooking the meals. So even teaching the children, we taught 10 to 13-year-olds how to cook pasta, how to fry an egg. Like, just sometimes it goes back to the basics, and it's those small programs, it's those smaller things that help make change. And sorry, I'm rambling. I have a cold, but I hope that was kind of the things that were running through my mind.
Well, and thank you for sharing that story, Pam. That's a great point. Whoever you brought that up to, we want to judge those people as well. Those people were probably caught in their own unseen pattern of judging people from your neighborhood and not really realizing they're doing it because, as you said, they're living incongruently with their values. So they've been conditioned to one thing, but they feel another one. That often causes conflict in our lives that, for most of us, comes to a head in midlife. It's what our midlife crisis is, when we start to finally reconcile that we're behaving in a different way than we actually believe. So I'd like to think that what you did was brought awareness to their behavior, that they could start to think, I really am kind of being a jerk, and I really am oppressing. If you tell people, if you confront someone, most people who have racist tendencies or that type of things, and you kind of point out they're being racist, they'll deny it. They're in complete denial because they believe that they're not racist. They don't understand that that their core values, they're probably not racist, but their condition is such, their behavior is such, that's acting in accordance, and they haven't reconciled those two. And I think your story does a great job of illustrating that. Thanks for sharing.
That also made me think too that, back on that sort of individual responsibility piece, that we really look at the individual and not the system that caused poverty and racism and inequality. And that is so problematic, right? Like, every single system people are being harmed in, and that is incongruent with our values. And so instead of looking at it and saying, how are we going to do it differently, we just don't look at it. And that's right. That was definitely Jennifer Carey did trauma of racism. And I think in racism, we can really see the trauma patterns of our culture. Like, you know what? It's not really happening. Like, talking about it's the problem, not racism. We should just not ever talk about it. And then, like, let's just pretend this isn't really a thing and we'll just move forward. How often do we do that with painful things in our lives? We just sort of, rather than, we have this belief that if we actually look at it and cope with it and try to align things with our values, everything will fall apart. And it's really the opposite. When we don't do it is when it all falls apart.
Well, we're hedonistic, so we don't want to be uncomfortable and unpleasant. And those conversations are uncomfortable. And you've heard my analogy about running through the fire. For those who haven't heard, I'll give a quick overview. I'm a retired firefighter, and statistically, people who die in fires die of smoke inhalation. Most of them are found either under a piece of furniture or in a closet. And because what they do is when the fire is threatening them and they can't get out, they hide from the fire. Now that seems illogical to us because where we're sitting here while we're not in a fire, we're like, well, the fire is just going to burn under the bed or burn in the closet. But when they're in the fire, they don't think rationally. They just want to get away from what's going to hurt them. So they go under a bed or in the closet. So the point is that we can use that circumstance and look and see that their only solution is to run through the fire to get outside. Now, and that's still going to hurt them. They're going to get burned, but they're going to survive. They're going to get outside. They're going to heal, that type of thing. And our behavior as human beings, we're hedonistic. So we run away from the pain. We don't want to run through the fire and get burned. But talking about unpleasant things and admitting unpleasant things about ourselves is the only way that we can progress through this. And again, that goes back to my first statement. We have to get away from the pathology. We have to get away from looking at people and pointing fingers and saying something's wrong with you. You're screwed up. If you want to have a conversation with someone who's being racist, but probably at their fundamental core isn't racist because of conditioning, you can't just walk up and wave your finger in their face. They're immediately going to be on the defensive. That's what the ego does. Anytime anyone attacks us, we immediately go on the defensive and we're not going to hear a word that they say. So we have to quit the division and the pathologizing and start having just compassionate conversations. So you want empathy, you got to give empathy, which is easier said than done, especially when you're coming from a place of oppression and abuse. And I know that's a fine line that we don't have time to talk about today and to go into detail. We certainly don't. Someone who's being abused, we don't want them to enable their abuser. It's not what I mean at all. But we just have to inject the sympathy and understand why people act, why we all act the way we do, and work together through that.
So maybe that's a good segue. We have about 10 minutes left because Laurie needs to end to move on to the next Zoom she has. But if people have thoughts about what to do with this kind of thinking, or hopefully it has at least stimulated your thinking. It certainly has mine, and I've already been thinking about this a lot, but that was really the intent, was to just begin to get more of us talking and thinking about this so that it spreads, so that we can have much more consciousness raising because of our awareness. So I don't know if people have thoughts about if you have opportunity to do this in your community, in your workplace, in your residence, even just doing the individual work, as Bradley says, will make a difference. But I would love to hear if people have any thoughts or ideas about what to do with this.
I
Go ahead, John.
All right. Earlier, one of the speakers talked about the narrative and the many different narratives that are around the sub-narratives and all that. And I think what needs to happen is that we have to acknowledge that we've been fed a false narrative, which is happening now. I think people are becoming more aware that we've been fed a false narrative for a long, long time, and we need to change that narrative. And we need to increase the awareness that we have been fed a false narrative, and we need to start describing what the actual narrative is and create a new one, right? And so talking about things like this in groups like this and out in the community is a wonderful thing to be able to do to change the narrative, right? And that's what I did when I found out that my father wasn't my father and all that stuff. What did I do? I went back to the old narrative and then tried to understand what was the story that was told. And I actually went to the actual documents historically and researched it and found out what the true story was. Right, what actually happened, right? Now, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't need to have all the answers, but I got a corrective narrative. And that helped me to grow. It helped me to understand my mother and my mother's mother, because I got a better perspective and I got a correct narrative, right? So I think that's one possible way to look at this, is that we need to correct a false narrative that we've been fed. I'll shut up now. Thanks.
I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you.
I agree about that. I think that talking in this type of forum and doing more of the groundwork is very helpful. I think one of the most important things that I would take away is that, it's kind of, this racism or all of these things that affect people's day-to-day lives is, it's not necessarily at the top, but it is in the middle, or the people that are in the community. It's not necessarily this thing that you can see so clearly that's like, being instrumented, but it's in our policies. And so it's not directly the people themselves that may be racist or may intend to cause harm, but and more of their training, or more of the practices that they've done for so long that they really may have thought was working or helpful, is really important. I always like to think that even bad habits can be unlearned, or things that are taught can be retaught and retrained. I think, again, one of the most easiest ways to learn or go about it is having these type of conversations. Is very helpful. Sometimes when you tell something to someone, you're really telling yourself that. You're really trying to make peace with what you're saying. Like, oh, I can preach it, but I might not be able to practice it. And preaching it in itself is practicing it. I think having these type of forums or ways to be able to speak on it is one of the most healthiest and helpful ways to get things accomplished. I always say, when you kind of want to change policies or procedures, you start on a community level first. You start at a social level, just with, relationships with siblings or relationship with friends. That's really
So well put. I love all the things you've said. That was really helpful. Laurie, I don't know if did you have any thoughts, Laurie? Any?
So many thoughts. I think the thing so many thoughts. The thing that's really stuck in my head, one of the things that Bradley said was, that, help people, don't hurt people, or don't get in the way of other people trying to help people. And I just think about, like, so many of the barriers that we're facing has to do with people getting in the way, not just people, but it's like people, but like institutionalized into like bureaucracy, right? Like, we've created these rules, and so what you say a lot, Amy, it's like we've created these rules and these systems, and that now we say, and we created them, but we say, oh, we can't do that. We can't let that happen. When that's the exact thing that could not just help that individual person, but could actually break generational cycles of violence and trauma. And like, I'm just really, it was such a simple line, like, help people, don't hurt people, don't get in the way of people who are trying to help people. But like, I feel like our systems are just that. So I'm going to really think about that.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's so much to think about right? And I love that people recognize how important it is to talk to other people about it. And that's been so much of my learning, is like, there are so many pieces I don't interact with or I don't see. And then hearing from people that the exact same things are happening in the system of elder care, in the system of behavioral health, in the system of child welfare, in the system of policing. All of these systems have these same pieces of wanting, it's all about individual responsibility. If you're being harmed, it must be your fault in some way. We really aren't going to take the time to listen to the ways you've been harmed. And if like, it's really painful to think that we're going to just keep on participating in it that way. And so I'm just grateful, because I've heard everywhere people saying, yeah, we can't just keep doing what we've been doing. And again, no quick answers to that, but the more we bring it up in the more places and the more spaces, and like, it's going that way in Florida and Canada too. Like, this is not just one place. I think it's time, like Age of Aquarius, it's time to change how we do things, how we interact. It's outmoded, it's outdated, it's not what we want it to be. And so we're the ones who need to step up and make it different. Not sure how, but the will is probably going to be the most important part of getting us there. Any closing thoughts or comments? Definitely so appreciate that people have been here. They've spent the whole time thinking with us about this, sharing about this. So many amazing comments. My mind is going in circles with all the new kinds of ways to think about things. And Laurie, I particularly appreciate you framing this conversation and the recognition that finding these patterns is what research is for, what we want to do. We want to understand what's happening so that we can get the right outcomes, the outcomes we say we want. Next month, we're going to look at the trauma of leaving Afghanistan, refugee trauma. This is going to be a big one too. Wow. But thank you all again for being here and for thinking about this and for just caring about other people, because as many people said, that is what's at the center of this. If we care and we want to take care of people, the magic will happen. It just will. All right. Thanks again. See you soon.